The way I see it, there are three ingredients needed to turn a sporting event into a true sporting spectacle. First, you need two or more excellent participants. This is rare enough on its own, as in most competitions, the good players and teams only play each other towards the end, but on that point, the second requirement for one of these is having legitimately high stakes. A regular season matchup between two league leaders is great, but for the contest to really mean something and stick in the mind years after the fact, there has to be something legitimately on the line. But even if the stars do align, and you're lucky enough to get one of these great matchups at the exact right time, there's no guarantee that the event itself will live up to all the hype. But if it does live up to the hype, or even somehow exceeds it, then I would suggest settling in and grabbing some popcorn, because in that moment, you are in the middle of something truly special, and there's a chance that you'll never see anything like it ever again. For my money, the 2008 Wimbledon men's final between Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal was one of the best of them. Maybe the best, and I'm prepared to spend 20 minutes or more explaining why. Let's take a second to run through our criteria. Federer and Nadal were ranked first and second in the world respectively at the time of this match, which comfortably meets the threshold for the quality of participants. The stakes weren't an issue either. Not only is Wimbledon the most prestigious of tennis's 4 Grand Slams, but this was the third year in a row that these two men met in the final of the same tournament, with Federer having the opportunity to win his record 6th Wimbledon title in a row. And as for the quality of the match, well, let's just say for the moment that it was high, like maybe the best tennis match of all time high. But even with all three of our requirements met with flying colors, that's still not enough to explain what made it so special. Tennis is really interesting to look at from a psychological perspective, because outside of fighting sports, which are kind of their own thing that I'll probably cover in the future, there's really nothing else like it in terms of competition. We talk a lot about head-to-head matchups in sports, especially when there's a big meeting between two stars to hype up, but in the context of the games themselves, they're actually pretty rare. Quarterbacks like Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen go up against each other in a figurative sense, but unless something crazy happens, they're not actually on the field at the same time. Two basketball stars may guard each other over the course of a game, but they're not going to be in the game the whole time, and will always have 4 teammates on the court alongside them when they are. Singles tennis is unique in the notion that when two of their stars play each other, they're actually playing each other, and no one else. There are no teammates, no substitutions, and very little in the way of things coming between them and their opponent. And in my opinion, that cranks everything we've talked about here so far up to 11, and then some. The stakes become inherently more personal. Each competitor bears the weight of the contest on their own shoulders. There's no shared responsibility for how things go, because who would you even share it with? Legacies will be built and deconstructed based on the outcomes of the games between these two people, whether they like it or not. It's a level of intimacy and jeopardy that's difficult to replicate outside of a Grand Slam final, especially Wimbledon, but that's exactly where Federer and Nadal found themselves in 2008. And once this match actually got going, it did not disappoint. Just like this match did, we're going to start out with a lot of Nadal. This is one of those sports narrative tropes that I usually kind of shy away from, but there is definitely an element of the whole impossible force, a movable object thing going on here. Nadal had been a growing threat to Federer for several years by that point. Born and raised on the island of Mallorca, Nadal comes from a family of athletes and emerged very young as an elite prospect. He won his first ATP event in 2004 at just 18, and then broke out in 2005, winning 11 different tournaments, including his first Grand Slam at the 2005 French Open. And I say his first Grand Slam because he went on to win the next 3 French Opens in a row, including an absolute smackdown in the final over Federer just a few weeks before this match at Wimbledon. One of the most interesting aspects of this match, and the Federer and Nadal rivalry in general, was their contrast in styles. If Federer was known for things like precision and fluidity, Nadal countered that with sheer power and athleticism. All of that is an oversimplification, of course. In reality, Federer has plenty of power and athleticism, and Nadal has plenty of technical fluidity, but especially when they played each other, those differences in styles tended to come out pretty strongly. And early on, Nadal was absolutely pounding the ball exactly where he wanted it to go, and putting Federer where he wanted him in the process. This was not just a standard Grand Slam final for Nadal. This was a chance to show everyone in the tennis world that he wasn't just a clay court specialist anymore. He'd won on other surfaces by this point, including a win over Federer in Dubai in 2006, but he'd never beaten Federer on anything other than clay in a Grand Slam, and even at just 22, some people were starting to question if that was ever going to change. Because sometimes sports people just can't help themselves with that kind of thing. This is what happens sometimes when someone has one superhuman level skill that sets them apart. Katie Ledecky was the best distance swimmer in the world by the time she was a teenager, at which point the question then became, can she do anything else? To which the answer was, yes, she absolutely can. It just took a little longer. Whether it's a pitcher with elite stuff who has to develop control, or a winger with elite speed that develops a better end product, top-level skills tend to come out a little bit earlier. Being well-rounded, either in the sense that you build your own skill set or learn to mask your weaknesses, usually takes time and experience. Nadal's development was on full display in that first set in 2008 though, which he won 6-4. He was off to a great start, but if he wanted to prove to everyone that he wasn't just the clay guy, he was going to have to beat arguably the most well-rounded tennis player there's ever been. And that was not going to be easy. Most great tennis players try and find practice partners that will directly mimic the playing style of their next opponent. When Federer was about to play Nadal, for instance, he would try and bring in a lefty, preferably a pretty powerful and athletic one, to prepare himself for what it was going to be like. But when Nadal was getting ready to play Federer, he didn't do that, because, in his uncle and coach's own words, there was not really any point. Federer was just too good and too skilled for anyone to even try and approximate him, which kind of tells you everything you need to know about the man himself. If you read about Federer or listen to people talk about him, it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that among his many weapons on the tennis court, his greatest one might have been his aura. In addition to all the stuff you'd expect from an elite athlete, like prodigious talent, work ethic, and intelligence, Federer also had a game that featured no significant weaknesses. How would you even try to beat him? He could make shots that no one else could even think of, and do it consistently, without looking like the effort was affecting him at all. And that perceived invincibility was a powerful psychological tool, but he was also legitimized by his performance on the court. From 2005 to 2010, he reached the finals of 18 out of 19 Grand Slams he entered, and won 12. This was the period when all-time greats like Pete Sampras were calling Federer the greatest player ever, but interestingly, the build-up to that 2008 Wimbledon tournament was probably the only time in that period where his invulnerability started to show a few cracks. I mentioned that Federer only missed one final in a Grand Slam between 2005 and 2010. Well, that one came at the beginning of 2008, the Australian Open, where he lost in the semifinals to a then 20-year-old Novak Djokovic. And, in hindsight, that's pretty clearly not that bad of a loss, but at the time, when Federer was number one in the world and had made 10 straight finals, it was a pretty big deal. Federer later revealed that he'd been dealing with mono since the end of 2007, but it was nonetheless pretty jarring to see him lose to Andy Murray in the first round in Dubai and not even make a final until his fifth tournament of the season. Not exactly the form you want to be in going into the biggest tournament of the year. And already down a set in the Wimbledon final, Federer lost the second one too, another 6-4, seemingly feeding into the narrative that the champ might be in real trouble this time. But then, it started raining. Very little about this match went according to the usual plan, including the start time. Rain delays were pretty normal at Wimbledon in the days before they put a roof on center court, but this final started about half an hour after it was supposed to, and there was a significant threat of more rain coming later. And the match itself wasn't following the set pattern either. Federer was usually the one who got way ahead, and then Nadal had to scratch and claw his way back into the match. But in 2008, it was Nadal who jumped out to a commanding two-set lead, and Federer, for the first time in a long time at Wimbledon, had to go into battle mode. At 3-3 in the third set, Nadal had a triple break point that would have put him tantalizingly close to winning Wimbledon, only for Federer to scrap his way back into it by winning 5 consecutive points and holding serve. The 5-time defending champion had survived, but crucially, he'd also stopped Nadal's momentum and given him something to think about. And that was relevant because he was about to have a good amount of time to be alone with his thoughts. With Federer up 5-4 in the third set, the rain returned, delaying the match for another hour and a half. I'm always fascinated by what happens in these kind of moments because whether it's for weather or something else, they're not all that uncommon. It's hard to quantify things like momentum or focus, but if you're a precisely calibrated athlete in the middle of the biggest competition of your life, I think it's fair to say that something like this would be pretty disruptive. These people are obsessed with control. They spend hundreds and thousands of hours every year preparing their bodies and brains for every eventuality they can, both on and off the court. And while it would have been perfectly logical to expect rain at Wimbledon, because that happened a lot in those days, there will always be aspects of high-level competition that you can't predict, like the rain coming right then, at the moment in the match where everything was starting to shift. Not coincidentally, one of my favorite measures of a great athlete is how they respond to uncertainty and randomness, and the adjustments they make to the things they can't control. Federer and Nadal had an unscheduled 80-minute break in the middle of an incredibly tense match with stakes as high as they possibly could be. And when it ended and the tarp came off, they both had to get themselves back up to speed mentally and physically all over again. It was like the first part of the match was its own separate thing, and the second part they were warming up for now was an entirely new match. That probably sounded pretty good to Federer on some level, but He'd also just had all of the momentum he worked so hard to create stopped dead, and Nadal had had over an hour to regroup. There was no way to predict how either one of them was going to respond, but we were about to find out. After the restart, Federer continued battling to get the set to a tiebreak at 6-6, setting up another situation in this match where no one was really sure what was going to happen. Neither Federer or Nadal had lost a tiebreak in the entire tournament so far, so something had to give, which again kind of summarizes this match on the whole. Either the unstoppable force was going to finally finish off this match and win Wimbledon, or the immovable object was going to keep himself alive for a fourth set. And in the end, it was the second one. Federer hit an absolute missile of an ace to win the tiebreak 7-5 and extend the match into a fourth set. And even though Nadal was still very much in command of the match, the fact that he hadn't been able to put Federer away had opened the door for a little bit of doubt to start creeping in. And even as the soon-to-be number one player in the world, you wouldn't really blame him for that sort of thing, both because this was Roger Federer he was playing against, and because this kind of thing had happened before, like almost exactly a year before. Before 2008 entered the conversation for the greatest Wimbledon final ever, the 2007 final, which was also between Federer and Nadal, did the same thing. Federer had only dropped one set in the entire tournament up to that point, but dropped two to Nadal that day, and took two more to tiebreaks that extended the match to nearly 4 hours. But by his own admission, Nadal unraveled by the end of the match, both physically and mentally. As would be the case many more times over the course of his career, Nadal's knee started bothering him in the middle of the fourth set. In the most pressure-packed match he'd ever played in, Nadal wrote in his self-titled autobiography that he, quote, flagged mentally and veered from his game plan under the pressure. Federer won that day in their toughest encounter yet, leaving Nadal absolutely shattered in every sense of the word. So you can imagine that as Federer started to claw his way back into the match in 2008, what happened to Nadal in 2007, the injury, the mental issues, all of it, was probably at least in the back of his mind. It certainly doesn't seem impossible based on how he played that fourth set. With the sun setting in the background, the two men traded some of the best rallies you'll ever see, finished off by some truly insane winners to enter another tiebreak. And that tiebreak is pretty widely regarded as one of the most important moments in the history of tennis. With the championship within reach, Nadal zoomed ahead to a 5-2 lead, just 2 points away from winning Wimbledon. But Federer just would not go away. It's important to emphasize here that Federer was not able to come back and win that fourth set simply because Nadal was playing badly. He was playing the opposite of badly, in fact. He was kind of playing the match of his life, but that's also the point. For the last couple of sets especially, Federer was just playing that much better, and if I'm Rafael Nadal in that situation, I'd be wondering, how the hell am I supposed to beat this guy? You've given your best shot to the greatest player of all time, and not only has he survived it, but he's gotten himself back onto even footing in the match, with all of the momentum going into the last set. It was set to be a repeat of the 2007 final, with Nadal playing up to his best and having a great chance to win, but the tennis gods appeared to just choose Federer over him for whatever reason. If he was going to close it out, though, and fulfill his lifelong dream of winning Wimbledon, he was going to have one more chance in the last set to turn it all around. And that meant he was going to need to listen to his Uncle Tony. In the documentary Strokes of Genius, which was based on the book by L. John Wertheim with the same title, Tony Nadal mentions always telling his nephew to have buena cara, which literally means good face, but is actually referring to Rafael always having a good attitude, even in moments of frustration or adversity. And I love that idea, especially in the context of something like this final in 2008, where between Federer's comeback and the continued interruptions for weather, there was plenty of both of those things going around the Nadal camp. There were more layers getting added to it by the minute, too. Were he to lose this match, the narrative of him always being second best to Federer would only get stronger, and because of all the rain delays, including another one in this fifth set, the court was getting so dark that the Hawkeye tracking system stopped working because it literally couldn't find the ball. And then there was his opponent, the 5-time defending champion, who was just as motivated to break the all-time record as Nadal was to win it for the first time. But there was something different about this version of Nadal. A few weeks before this final, he'd gone straight from beating Federer in the French Open final to his next tournament at the Queen's Club Championships. Most players would have taken at least a little bit of time off after winning a major, but Nadal was absolutely determined to make the transition from clay to grass as quickly and as well as possible, so there would be no breaks for the world number 2. And I mention all that to say that Rafa had put in the work and adjusted his game in 2008 to the point that he was more locked in on grass than he'd ever been. So that even with Federer making the heroic comeback and so many things being seemingly stacked against him, Nadal would have what it took to win it at the end, because he was going to need every last bit of it to beat Federer. After needing tiebreaks to finish both of the previous 2 sets, it was no surprise that the last set was also incredibly close. At this point in their careers, there just wasn't that much to separate these two guys, and their most famous head-to-head matchup was probably the best evidence of that. Federer served first, which was relevant because after 8 p.m. local time, the darkness was really starting to become a problem, and winning break points was going to be even harder than it was normally. Federer got all the way to within 2 points of winning the title, only for Nadal to flip the narrative from the previous 2 sets, hold serve, and keep the match going. Not being able to break the other guy's serve was a bit of a theme in this match, especially in crucial moments, but finally, at 7-7 in the final set, Nadal broke Federer to get to 8-7 and paved the way for all this previous hard work to pay off. In the end, this was one of the greatest contests in the history of modern sports. The only downside was that, by rule, somebody had to lose.
There's a new man at the head of men's tennis, Rafael Nadal.
I can't give you that much tactical or technical analysis of this match, so if that's what you came for, I'm sorry. But to me, this is less a story about a tennis match that happened in the late 2000s, and more a story about how we as sports fans always need one person to be the best, and how sometimes fate steps in and says, okay, but what if there were 2 instead? It's a story about dealing with uncertainty and how 2 rivals can bring out the best in each other while also maintaining high levels of respect and admiration between the 2 of them. And it's about a man's quest to improve himself as much as humanly possible. This matchup had everything you want out of a truly great sports moment. 2 competitors at the peak of their powers, high stakes, and most of all, a match that you couldn't have dreamed up even if you tried. The quality on display in this final was just absurd, especially when you consider that it took nearly 7 hours to complete. These 2 men pushed themselves to their absolute max in the most pressurized situation possible, and yeah, when you put all that together, you get an explosion of sporting excellence that we can still happily enjoy nearly 20 years after the fact. For all the storylines, physical excellence, and mental fortitude on display that evening, there are 100 different words or more that you could use to describe the 2008 Wimbledon final. But for me, I think I can sum up the 4,000 plus words I've written here in just one. The 2008 Wimbledon final is, and was, and always will be, unmatched. Hi everybody, this is your first time hanging out with us. My name is Will, and this is my channel, Student of the Game, where we talk about sports psychology and culture. It's been a while since I've talked about tennis, but reading John Wertheim's book about this match and watching the corresponding documentary convinced me that it was a good topic to take on. I was a teenager at the time this match actually happened, and I only remember watching the end of it, but the quality was so high and the occasion was so important that it'll always be a core sports memory for me. If you enjoyed the episode, I can tell you that we've got some really cool content coming in the next couple of months, so if you're into that sort of thing, like the video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date. That's all for this video though. Once again, I'm Will, and this is Student of the Game. Bye!